On a bright autumn morning in suburban Philadelphia, Officer Richard Thompson sat in his patrol car, scanning the streets of the affluent Oak Hill neighborhood. His attention fixed on a sleek black Mercedes that had just turned onto Maple Avenue. Behind the wheel was a well-dressed black woman in her mid-30s, and something about her presence in this predominantly white neighborhood didn't sit right with him, at least in his mind. The woman, Dr. Alexandra Wilson, was actually heading home after completing her morning rounds at the city's top hospital, where she served as the head of cardiology. She'd lived in Oak Hill for the past 5 years with her husband, Police Captain James Wilson, though Officer Thompson, being new to the force, wasn't aware of this fact. As Dr. Wilson smoothly navigated her car through the tree-lined streets, she noticed the patrol car slowly pulling out behind her. She'd experienced this before, the subtle surveillance, the unwarranted attention, but today, she was simply too exhausted from a 12-hour shift to give it much thought. Officer Thompson followed her for 3 blocks, looking for any excuse to initiate a stop. When Dr. Wilson's turn signal blinked exactly 99 feet before her turn instead of the required 100 feet, he found his opportunity. The patrol car's lights flashed to life, and the siren chirped. Dr. Wilson felt her heart sink, not from fear, but from disappointment. As she pulled over, she could see her house just 2 doors down. The home where she and James had hosted the police department's Christmas party just last December. The irony wasn't lost on her. The interaction that followed would soon become the talk of the entire police department. Officer Thompson approached the vehicle with his hand resting on his holster, a detail that didn't escape Dr. Wilson's notice. She kept both hands visible on the steering wheel, following the safety protocol her husband had advised for all citizens. "License and registration," Officer Thompson demanded, his tone carrying an edge that seemed disproportionate to a simple traffic stop. As Dr. Wilson reached for her documents, she remained calm, drawing from years of handling high-pressure situations in the operating room. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" she inquired professionally, maintaining eye contact through her rearview mirror. The response she received was laden with condescension. "You failed to signal properly. And I need to verify that this vehicle belongs in this neighborhood." As Officer Thompson scrutinized her license, Dr. Wilson noticed his demeanor shift slightly. Her address matched the wealthy neighborhood they were in, and her credentials as a doctor didn't fit the profile he'd constructed in his mind. "Still," he pressed on, "how long have you lived here? This is a very expensive area." The situation was about to take an unexpected turn when another police vehicle pulled up behind them. Captain James Wilson had just finished his shift and was heading home when he recognized his wife's car. What he witnessed next would spark a department-wide conversation about unconscious bias and the need for comprehensive reform. The autumn breeze carried fallen leaves across the scene as 3 lives intersected in a moment that would challenge perspectives and force uncomfortable but necessary conversations within the police force. Dr. Wilson sat quietly, knowing that what happened next would either perpetuate a cycle of prejudice or become a catalyst for change. As the morning sun cast long shadows through the oak trees, this seemingly routine traffic stop was about to transform into a powerful lesson about assumptions, privilege, and the complex dynamics of race in modern America. The events that would unfold over the next few minutes would ripple through the department and the community, touching lives far beyond the quiet street where 3 people's paths had crossed on this autumn morning. As Captain James Wilson stepped out of his patrol car, the tension in the air became palpable. He took a moment to observe the scene before him, his wife, calm and collected as always, sitting in her Mercedes, and Officer Thompson, who was still holding her license with an air of suspicion. The morning light caught the gold band on Dr. Wilson's finger, the same ring that matched the one Captain Wilson wore, though Officer Thompson remained oblivious to this connection. With measured steps, Captain Wilson approached, his presence commanding yet controlled. "Is there a problem here, Officer Thompson?" Captain Wilson's voice carried the weight of authority, causing Thompson to straighten instinctively before turning around. The recognition hit Thompson like a physical force, the man standing before him wasn't just any superior officer, but the police captain himself. "Captain Wilson, sir. I was just conducting a routine traffic stop. The driver failed to signal properly and—" Thompson's voice trailed off as he watched his captain walk past him and approach the Mercedes. The next few moments would become legendary within the department. "Good morning, sweetheart," Captain Wilson said warmly to Dr. Wilson, then turned back to face Officer Thompson, whose face had drained of color. "I see you've met my wife, Officer Thompson. Dr. Alexandra Wilson, Chief of Cardiology at City General. The same Dr. Wilson who saved Officer Rodriguez's life last month during his emergency heart surgery." The silence that followed was deafening. Officer Thompson's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. The reality of his actions, and their implications, began to sink in. The woman he'd profiled as suspicious in this affluent neighborhood was not only a distinguished physician but also the captain's wife. Dr. Wilson finally broke the silence, her voice steady and professional. "James, Officer Thompson was concerned about whether I belonged in this neighborhood. Perhaps we should invite him in for coffee? It might be a good opportunity to get to know each other better." The suggestion carried no malice, only a genuine desire to bridge the gap that prejudice had created. Captain Wilson nodded, understanding his wife's intention. This was her way, not to condemn, but to educate. To transform uncomfortable moments into opportunities for growth. It was one of the many reasons he'd fallen in love with her 15 years ago during a chance meeting at a community outreach program. Officer Thompson stood rooted to the spot, his earlier confidence replaced by shame and embarrassment. The training manual had never prepared him for this situation. His mind raced back to all the assumptions he'd made: the expensive car, the affluent neighborhood, the color of Dr. Wilson's skin. Each assumption now felt like a weight pressing down on his shoulders. I apologize, Dr. Wilson. "Captain, sir, I didn't know." Thompson stammered, his face flushed with embarrassment. But Dr. Wilson raised her hand gently, interrupting his apology. "Officer Thompson, knowing who I am shouldn't be the reason for treating me with respect. Every person deserves that basic courtesy, regardless of their title or position," she said, her words carrying the wisdom of countless similar experiences. Captain Wilson placed a supportive hand on his wife's shoulder, their unity evident in this simple gesture. "Thompson, join us for coffee. We need to have a conversation that's long overdue." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command delivered with the kind of authority that comes from years of leadership. As they stood there on that quiet suburban street, the morning traffic continuing around them, all three individuals knew this moment would change more than just their perspectives. The invitation for coffee wasn't just about discussing what had happened, it was about understanding why it happened, and more importantly, how to prevent it from happening again. The autumn wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the promise of change. Sometimes, the most powerful lessons come from our most uncomfortable moments, and on this morning, Officer Thompson was about to learn one of the most important lessons of his career, one that no police academy could have taught him. Inside the Wilsons' elegant home, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Officer Thompson sat perched on the edge of a plush armchair, his coffee untouched on the mahogany table before him. The walls around them were adorned with photographs telling the story of the Wilsons' life together, their wedding day, Dr. Wilson's medical school graduation, Captain Wilson's promotion ceremony, and countless moments of their shared journey. Dr. Wilson moved gracefully through their kitchen, preparing a fresh pot of coffee while Captain Wilson sat across from Thompson, his presence both reassuring and intimidating. The family photos seemed to watch Officer Thompson, each one challenging his preconceptions about what a successful, affluent family should look like. "You know, Thompson," Captain Wilson began, breaking the uncomfortable silence, "when I first met Alexandra, I was a beat cop working in the roughest part of town. She was doing her residency, working 36-hour shifts at the free clinic. She could have chosen any prestigious hospital, but she chose to serve where she was needed most. Dr. Wilson returned with fresh coffee and homemade muffins, setting them down before taking her seat beside her husband. "I remember those days," she added with a warm smile. James would stop by the clinic during his patrols, claiming he was just maintaining community relations. Little did I know he was trying to work up the courage to ask me out. The personal story seemed to ease some of Thompson's tension, but the gravity of his actions still weighed heavily on him. He watched as Captain Wilson reached for his wife's hand, their fingers intertwining naturally, years of love and support evident in that simple gesture. "Sir, Dr. Wilson, I don't know what to say," Thompson finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've made terrible assumptions, and I've dishonored my badge." His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. Dr. Wilson leaned forward, her expression compassionate yet serious. "Officer Thompson, let me tell you about something that happened last week in my operating room. I had a patient, a young man who needed emergency surgery. When my team wheeled him in, his first words weren't about his condition. Instead, he looked at me and asked if there was another doctor available." She paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. "But you know what? I performed that surgery anyway, and I saved his life." The next day, that same man cried while thanking me. His prejudice almost cost him his life, but that experience changed him forever. Captain Wilson nodded, understanding the parallel his wife was drawing. "Thompson, what happened today isn't just about you, or us. It's about a larger pattern that we, as law enforcement officers, have the power, and the responsibility, to break." The morning sun streamed through the large bay windows, illuminating the room and the three individuals within it. Outside, the neighborhood was coming to life, joggers passing by, children heading to school, life continuing its normal rhythm, unaware of the profound conversation taking place inside the Wilson home. "The hardest part of growth," Dr. Wilson continued, "is acknowledging our biases. They're like a disease that needs to be diagnosed before it can be treated. Today could be your diagnosis day, Officer Thompson, if you're willing to learn from it." Thompson looked up from his coffee, meeting Dr. Wilson's eyes for the first time since entering their home. In her gaze, he found no anger, no resentment, only a genuine desire to help him understand and grow. "I want to learn," he said finally, his voice stronger now. "I want to be better than this. But I don't know where to start." Captain Wilson smiled for the first time that morning. "That's exactly where everyone should start, with the willingness to learn and change. Tomorrow, you'll be assigned to a new training program we've been developing. But today, right now, we're going to have an honest conversation about what happened this morning." As the morning progressed, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. What had started as a tense confrontation was transforming into something more meaningful, a moment of genuine understanding and potential change. The coffee grew cold in their cups as they talked, sharing experiences, challenging assumptions, and building bridges across the divide that prejudice had created. The following weeks at the police department took on a different atmosphere after the incident with Officer Thompson. The story had spread through the ranks, not as gossip, but as a powerful lesson. Thompson, who had once strutted through the halls with unearned confidence, now carried himself with a quieter, more thoughtful demeanor. Captain Wilson had kept his promise about the training program, but he'd done more than that. He'd used the incident as a catalyst for change within the department. The morning briefing room, usually filled with routine discussions about patrol assignments and incident reports, had become a space for more meaningful conversations. On this particular morning, Dr. Wilson had been invited to speak to the entire department. She stood at the front of the room, her professional demeanor commanding attention without demanding it. Officers who had only heard about her through the Thompson incident were now seeing firsthand the woman who had turned a potentially volatile situation into an opportunity for growth. "Law enforcement and medicine have more in common than you might think," Dr. Wilson began, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. In both professions, we make split-second decisions that can affect people's lives. The difference is, in medicine, we're trained to question our initial assumptions constantly. Officer Thompson sat in the front row, his notebook open, pen poised. The past few weeks had been transformative for him. Each shift had become an opportunity to apply what he'd learned from that morning at the Wilsons' home. He'd begun to notice his own biases, catching himself before making assumptions, and learning to approach each interaction with genuine curiosity rather than preconceived notions. Yesterday, Dr. Wilson continued, I had a patient refuse my care because of the color of my skin. 10 years ago, that would have shaken my confidence. Today, I understand that his prejudice is about him, not me. But what I want to discuss with you all is how we handle these situations when we're the ones in positions of power. The room fell silent. Every officer present understood the weight of her words. They wore badges that gave them authority, carried weapons that gave them power, but it was their judgment, their ability to see beyond their biases, that truly determined their worth as officers. Captain Wilson watched from the back of the room, pride evident in his expression. He'd seen the impact his wife had on people, how her approach to confronting bias was neither accusatory nor condemning, but rather enlightening and transformative. The department's statistics were already showing improvement, fewer complaints, better community relations, more positive interactions reported. Dr. Wilson shared more stories from her medical practice, drawing parallels between split-second medical decisions and law enforcement judgments. She talked about the importance of community trust, about how preconceptions can cloud judgment, and about the responsibility that comes with wearing either a white coat or a blue uniform. When Officer Thompson pulled me over that morning, she said, approaching the end of her presentation, he didn't see Dr. Wilson or Captain Wilson's wife. He saw what his biases told him to see. But what happened next, that's the story we should focus on. Because it's not about the mistakes we make, it's about how we learn from them. Thompson felt the eyes of his fellow officers on him, but for the first time, he didn't feel shame. Instead, he felt a sense of purpose. His mistake had become a stepping stone toward better policing, not just for him, but for the entire department. After the presentation, officers gathered in small groups, discussing what they'd heard. The conversation wasn't just about race anymore, it had expanded to include all forms of bias that could affect their judgment on the job. Veterans officers shared stories of their own learning experiences, creating an atmosphere of openness and vulnerability that was rare in law enforcement. As Dr. Wilson packed up her materials, Officer Thompson approached her. Dr. Wilson, he said, his voice steady, I wanted you to know that I've been keeping track. Since that morning, I've made 37 traffic stops. Each time, I've asked myself one question before approaching the vehicle: what assumptions am I making right now? Dr. Wilson smiled, recognizing the significance of his words. And has it changed your approach? She asked, though she already knew the answer from the reports she'd heard from her husband. Completely, Thompson replied. I've discovered that when I leave my assumptions behind, I actually become a better officer. I see people as people, not as stereotypes. It's like I was wearing tinted glasses before, and someone finally showed me how to take them off. The impact of Dr. Wilson's presentation rippled through the community in unexpected ways. Local news stations had picked up the story, not for its controversy, but for its remarkable resolution. The narrative of a police department actively working to address bias had caught the public's attention, offering hope in a time when such stories were rare. 1 month after the incident, Captain Wilson organized a community forum at the local community center. The large auditorium was packed with residents from all walks of life, along with officers from the department. The energy in the room was different from typical police community meetings. There was an openness, a willingness to engage in difficult conversations. Dr. Wilson sat in the front row, watching as her husband took the stage. She'd spent her morning performing a complicated heart surgery, but she wouldn't have missed this for anything. Beside her sat Officer Thompson, who had volunteered to share his story with the community. "Good evening," Captain Wilson began, his voice carrying authority tempered with warmth. "We're here today not just to talk about what's wrong, but to show you what we're doing to make it right. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen one interaction at a time." The audience listened intently as he shared the department's new initiatives, enhanced training programs, community engagement activities, and a newly established civilian oversight committee. But the real impact came when Officer Thompson stood up to speak. "A month ago, I made a mistake that could have ended my career," Thompson began, his voice slightly shaky but determined. "Instead, it became the most important learning moment of my life." He recounted the traffic stop, not sparing himself any embarrassment, laying bare his assumptions and biases for all to hear. As Thompson spoke, many in the audience nodded in recognition. Some had experienced similar stops, others had made similar assumptions. The honesty in his voice bridged gaps that had seemed insurmountable just weeks before. Dr. Wilson watched the faces in the crowd, seeing the same transformations she witnessed in her operating room when barriers of prejudice fell away. A young black teenager in the audience raised his hand, asking Thompson what made him change his perspective. "It wasn't just realizing I had stopped the captain's wife," Thompson responded thoughtfully. "It was understanding that every person I stop is somebody's loved one. Every person deserves the same respect I would want my family to receive." The forum continued for hours, with community members sharing their experiences and officers listening with genuine interest. Solutions were proposed, connections were made, and promises were exchanged, not empty political promises, but real commitments to change. Later that evening, as the event wound down, a small group gathered in the community center's kitchen. Dr. Wilson was brewing coffee. It had become her signature way of creating comfortable spaces for uncomfortable conversations. Officer Thompson was chatting with a community youth leader about starting a mentorship program. "You know," Dr. Wilson said, passing out cups of coffee, "when James first told me about implementing these changes in the department, I was skeptical. Not because I didn't believe in change, but because I know how resistant systems can be to it." Captain Wilson smiled, accepting a cup from his wife. The key was making it personal. When officers saw Thompson's transformation, they realized change wasn't just possible, it was necessary. A local pastor who had joined them nodded in agreement. "It's like dominoes," he said. "One person changes, then another, then another. Pretty soon, you've got a movement." As they talked, a call came in over the radio, a situation developing across town that required attention. Captain Wilson and Officer Thompson prepared to leave, duty calling. But something was different now. They weren't just responding as officers, they were responding as members of a community that was learning to trust them again. Dr. Wilson watched them go, remembering that morning when Thompson had pulled her over. She couldn't have known then that what seemed like just another discriminatory traffic stop would become a catalyst for such significant change. As she gathered her things to head home, she overheard two community members talking about the forum. For the first time, one said to the other, "I feel like they're not just hearing us, they're actually listening." The autumn evening was drawing to a close, but the work they'd started was just beginning. Real change, Dr. Wilson knew, wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. It was about these moments, these small, honest conversations that slowly but surely transformed hearts and minds. 6 months after the incident, the department's transformation had become a model for other precincts across the state. What started as an uncomfortable traffic stop had evolved into a comprehensive program of reform, with Officer Thompson and Dr. Wilson often invited to share their story at police academies and community forums. On this particular spring morning, Officer Thompson sat in his patrol car, parked outside the local high school. He was participating in the department's new community engagement initiative, where officers spent time getting to know the neighborhoods they served beyond just responding to calls. A group of students walked past his car, and instead of the usual apprehensive glances he used to receive, several waved hello. He recognized a few faces from the youth mentorship program he'd helped establish. One student, a young woman who aspired to become a police officer, stopped to chat. "Officer Thompson, did you hear?" she asked excitedly. "Dr. Wilson is going to be our graduation speaker next month." The news brought a smile to his face. The same woman he had once profiled was now becoming a symbol of resilience and change in their community. Meanwhile, at City General Hospital, Dr. Wilson was finishing her rounds when she received an unexpected visitor. The wife of a patient she'd operated on recently had brought her family to express their gratitude. As they talked, the woman shared how her husband had initially been hesitant about having a black female surgeon. "But then we heard your story," the woman explained, "about what happened with that traffic stop and how you turned it into something positive. It changed my husband's whole perspective. He says you didn't just save his heart, you opened it." Back at the station, Captain Wilson was reviewing the latest department statistics. Complaints about racial profiling had dropped significantly, while community engagement numbers had soared. But more importantly, the quality of police work had improved. Officers were solving more cases, building better relationships with witnesses, and earning trust in neighborhoods that had historically been wary of law enforcement. During the afternoon shift change, Thompson and his fellow officers gathered for their daily briefing. The conversation turned to a recent incident where an officer had recognized his own biases during a routine call and handled the situation differently because of it. Before Dr. Wilson's training, the officer shared, would have made assumptions about that situation. But I remembered what she taught us about questioning our initial judgments. It completely changed the outcome. Later that evening, the Wilsons hosted a dinner at their home for officers and community leaders. The dining room that had once been the site of an uncomfortable conversation with Officer Thompson was now filled with laughter and open dialogue. Dr. Wilson moved around the table, making sure everyone's plate was full. She paused behind her husband's chair, placing a hand on his shoulder. They shared a look, both remembering how far they'd come from that autumn morning. "You know what the best part is?" Thompson said during dinner, addressing the group. "It's not just about policing anymore. This has affected how I see everything. I'm a better father, a better neighbor, a better person." A community activist at the table nodded in agreement. "That's because real change happens from the inside out. When we change how we see others, we change how we see ourselves." As the evening progressed, plans were made for expanding their programs to neighboring districts. The incident that could have ended in anger and division had instead sparked a movement of understanding and growth. Dr. Wilson shared her latest experience from the hospital, where she'd been working with medical students on recognizing and addressing their own unconscious biases in patient care. The parallels between law enforcement and healthcare continued to provide valuable insights for both professions. 6 months ago, Captain Wilson reflected, addressing the group, "We had a choice. We could have handled that traffic stop like any other incident, with disciplinary action and mandatory sensitivity training. Instead, we chose to dig deeper, to address the root causes of bias in our department." The evening ended with plans for a community-wide celebration marking 6 months of positive change. But more importantly, it ended with hope that what they'd built together would continue to grow and inspire others. As their guests departed, Dr. Wilson and Captain Wilson stood in their doorway, watching Officer Thompson chat with some community members before heading to his car. The same driveway where he had once pulled her over was now a place where bridges were built and friendships were formed. The night air was warm with the promise of summer, carrying with it the sweet scent of possibility. What had started as one officer's mistake had blossomed into a community's triumph, proving that sometimes the best lessons come from our most uncomfortable moments. 1 year after the incident, the police department hosted a special ceremony in the City Hall's Grand Auditorium. The occasion was the launch of the Bridge the Gap initiative, a statewide program inspired by the transformation that had begun with that fateful traffic stop. Dr. Wilson stood at the podium, addressing a packed audience of law enforcement officers, community leaders, and citizens from across the state. Her presence commanded attention, not through authority, but through the quiet dignity that had turned a potential confrontation into a catalyst for change. "When I look out at this audience today," she began, "I don't see uniforms or civilian clothes. I see people who have chosen to be part of the solution. A year ago, I was pulled over in my own neighborhood, and today, that moment has led to something none of us could have imagined." In the front row, Officer Thompson sat beside his teenage daughter, who now dreamed of becoming both a police officer and a doctor, inspired by the two people who had shown her how to turn conflict into opportunity. He'd recently been promoted to Community Relations Sergeant, a position created specifically to implement the new programs he'd helped develop. Captain Wilson watched from the side of the stage, his chest swelling with pride as his wife continued to share their story. The department's success had drawn attention from police forces nationwide, with many sending representatives to learn from their experience. "Change," Dr. Wilson continued, "isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame. It's about having the courage to look in the mirror and ask ourselves uncomfortable questions. It's about being brave enough to answer those questions honestly." The ceremony included testimonials from community members whose lives had been impacted by the new initiatives. A young black businessman spoke about how his recent interaction with law enforcement had been dramatically different from his experiences in the past. An elderly white resident shared how her perspectives had shifted after participating in community dialogue sessions. During the reception that followed, Officer Thompson's daughter approached Dr. Wilson. "My dad's different now," she said simply. "He listens more. He sees more. And now I want to be like both of you, helping people and changing minds." The success stories weren't just anecdotal. Crime rates had decreased, community cooperation had increased, and the department's diversity recruitment numbers had risen significantly. Other departments were reporting similar improvements after implementing the program. Later that evening, a small group gathered in the Wilsons' backyard, the same property where Officer Thompson had made his traffic stop a year ago. The informal gathering included officers, community leaders, and families, all sharing stories and breaking bread together. Dr. Wilson worked the grill, a skill she'd perfected during countless community barbecues over the past year. Captain Wilson mingled with guests, many of whom had become close friends through their shared commitment to change. "You know what strikes me?" Thompson said, helping Dr. Wilson with the grilling. "A year ago, I couldn't even look you in the eye. Now here we are, arguing about how long to cook a burger." The laughter that followed was genuine, a testament to how far they'd come. The evening air was filled with the sounds of children playing, adults chatting, and music playing softly in the background, a symphony of community harmony that had once seemed impossible. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Dr. Wilson gathered everyone for a toast. "To growth," she said, raising her glass. "To change. To the courage to admit when we're wrong and the strength to do better." The gathering continued into the night, but it was more than just a celebration. It was a reminder that change, real lasting change, happens when people are willing to see past their initial judgments and connect on a human level. The story of the traffic stop had become legend in the department, not for its controversy, but for its aftermath. It was now part of the training curriculum at the police academy, taught alongside tactical skills and legal procedures as an example of how one moment can transform an entire community. As the guests began to leave, Dr. Wilson stood in her driveway, the same spot where she had once been questioned about belonging in her own neighborhood. Now it was a place of welcome, of connection, of community. The transformation wasn't just in policies or procedures, it was in hearts and minds. The night ended with plans for the future, expanding programs, reaching more communities, touching more lives. What had started as one officer's mistake had grown into a movement, proving that sometimes the best chapters of our story begin with the turning of an unexpected page. 5 years had passed since that pivotal traffic stop, and the city's landscape had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The Wilson Initiative, as it had come to be known nationally, was now being implemented in police departments across the country, with remarkable success stories emerging from every corner. On this particular morning, Dr. Wilson stood in front of a fresh batch of police academy recruits, now serving as a regular guest instructor. The young faces before her represented a new generation of law enforcement, one that was being trained not just in procedures and protocols, but in understanding and empathy. 5 years ago, she began, her voice carrying the weight of experience, I was pulled over in my own driveway. Today, I'm here to tell you why that moment changed not just my life, but policing as we know it. In the back of the room sat Officer Thompson, now Chief Thompson of the neighboring district. His promotion had made headlines as an example of how acknowledging and learning from mistakes could lead to exceptional leadership. His daughter was among the recruits, her dream of serving both law enforcement and medicine still very much alive. Captain Wilson, now Police Commissioner Wilson, had used his position to implement systemic changes that went beyond surface-level diversity training. The department had become a model of community-oriented policing, with officers regularly engaging in neighborhood programs, youth mentorship, and continuous bias awareness training. During the lunch break, Dr. Wilson sat with the recruits, sharing stories from both her medical practice and her experiences with law enforcement. One recruit asked about the hardest part of creating change. The hardest part, she replied, stirring her coffee thoughtfully, wasn't convincing people that change was necessary. It was helping them understand that change is a continuous journey, not a destination. The afternoon session included a practical exercise where recruits participated in role-playing scenarios, each designed to challenge their assumptions and biases. Chief Thompson joined in, sharing his personal story with each group. I could have lost my badge that day, he told them. Instead, I found my true calling as an officer. Sometimes our biggest mistakes can become our greatest opportunities for growth. Later that evening, a special ceremony was held at City Hall. The mayor was presenting the Wilson Initiative with a national award for excellence in community policing. The auditorium was filled with faces both familiar and new, officers who had been there from the beginning, community members who had witnessed the transformation, and representatives from departments across the country eager to learn from their success. Dr. Wilson took the stage alongside her husband and Chief Thompson. Looking out at the audience, she saw not just a gathering of people, but a testament to the power of turning conflict into connection. 5 years ago, she addressed the crowd, we had a choice. We could have let one incident divide us further, or we could use it as a foundation for building bridges. We chose to build, and look at what we've created together. The statistics spoke for themselves. Crime rates had continued to fall, community trust had soared, and the department had become one of the most sought after in the country. But the real success stories were in the daily interactions, the traffic stops that ended in genuine conversations, the community programs that brought officers and residents together, the changed perspectives that rippled through generations. After the ceremony, a small group gathered at the Wilsons' home, the same home where that transformative traffic stop had occurred. The driveway that had once been a place of confrontation was now a symbol of connection, where officers and community members regularly gathered for informal discussions and celebrations. Chief Thompson's daughter, now halfway through her police academy training, sat with Dr. Wilson in the kitchen. You know, she said, Dad tells that story at least once a week. He says it reminds him why we do this job, not just to enforce laws, but to build trust. As the evening wound down, Commissioner Wilson raised a toast. To 5 years of growth, to countless lives touched, and to the power of choosing understanding over anger, connection over division. The gathering continued late into the night, with stories being shared, lessons being learned, and new ideas being born. The Wilson Initiative had become more than just a program, it was a movement, a testament to the possibility of real, lasting change. Looking out at their gathered friends and colleagues, Dr. Wilson smiled. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every step. What had started as a moment of prejudice had blossomed into a legacy of understanding, proving that sometimes the most powerful changes begin in the most unexpected ways. As the stars appeared in the sky above their home, the same home where it all began, the promise of continued growth and understanding shone as brightly as ever. The story that had started with a traffic stop had become a beacon of hope, showing that with courage, compassion, and commitment, real change wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. The Wilson Initiative would continue to evolve, touching more lives and transforming more communities. But its core message would remain the same, that in every moment of conflict lies the seed of connection, waiting for those brave enough to nurture it into growth.